Hello Internet, it's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes. We probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings segments. And today's topic is about the Druedain and a powerful magical ability that they possess. Something that rivals the most powerful magics in Tolkien's mythology. Most of my readings today will come from a short story in the Unfinished Tales called The Faithful Stone, and I'll explain it as we go along. But first, as always, a little background. I've already done a video on the Druedain, feel free to check that out. However, that video focused on the Druedain in the Third Age, notably during the War of the Ring. My last video on Tol Ilmar actually discussed the Druedain of the Second Age, particularly their relationship with the men of the House of Halath. They did not get along. Tol Ilmar names the Druedain as one of the three enemies of his people. In the Second Age, the men of the House of Halath, these early Dunlendings, took the land from the Druedain by force, pushing them deeper into the wilds. This video is going to focus on the Druedain of the First Age. Turns out, in the First Age, they had a great relationship with the House of Halath. A faction of the Druedain coexisted peacefully with the House of Halath in Beleriand. They all lived in the forest of Brethil. This land technically belonged to the elven king Thingol, but he left the House of Halath and the Druedain alone, allowing them to go about their business, as long as they protected the borders of the forest, mainly from orcs. Just to clarify, when I say the Druedain, I'm not talking about the Dunedain, the Rangers. The Druedain were also known as the Wild Men of the Woods. In some ways, they're like hobbits in that they're a branch of humanity. They're related to the other houses of the Edain, but they have their own unique qualities. They're secretive, cautious, and they are at home in nature. Their tracking and forest survival skills are off the charts. And as a side note, they know what plants make poisons, and they tend to use poison darts and poison arrows as weapons. So, the Faithful Stone is about a particular member of the Druedain, aka the Droog, named Agan. Tolkien calls him a leech. I don't think that he means he borrows money from his friends and doesn't pay them back. I think in this context, it means Agan is a healer. And he likely uses leeches in his work, considering they're still used in hospitals today. Agan is a good friend of a member of the House of Halath named Beric, who happens to live somewhat isolated in the forest, away from the village of his people. On a time, there was a Droog named Agan, well known as a leech. He had a great friendship with Beric, a forester of the folk, who lived in a house in the woods 2 miles or more from the nearest village. The dwellings of Agan's family were nearer, and he spent most of his time with Beric and his wife, and was much loved by their children. There came a time of trouble, for a number of daring orcs had secretly entered the woods nearby, and were scattered in 2s and 3s, waylaying any that went abroad alone, and at night attacking houses far from neighbors. The household of Beric were not much afraid, for Agan stayed with them at night and kept watch outside. But one morning, he came to Beric and said, "Friend, I have ill news from my kin, and I fear I must leave you a while. My brother has been wounded, and he lies now in pain and calls for me, since I have skill in treating orc wounds. I will return as soon as I may." Beric was greatly troubled, and his wife and children wept. But Agan said, "I will do what I can. I have had a watchstone brought here and set near your house." Beric went out with Agan and looked at the watchstone. It was large and heavy, and sat under some bushes not far from his doors. Agan laid his hand upon it, and after a silence said, "See, I have left with it some of my powers. May it keep you from harm." So Beric's family is a target for marauding orcs, since his house is so remote. But Agan apparently gives Beric's family protection 24/7. That's service. You know, I said the Druedain shouldn't be confused with the Dunedain, But they do have some striking similarities. They are expert woodsmen who keep to themselves, but also protect the people in their region from harm. But we've reached a bit of a crisis point. As a healer, Agon's been called away to try to save his brother's life. Understandable. But he leaves behind a watchstone in his stead. We actually see versions of these watchstones in The Lord of the Rings. When we're introduced to Dunharrow and the switchbacks leading up to the plateau known as the Firienfeld, we get this description of the stones. And remember, this is late in the Third Age, several thousand years after Agon, suggesting the Druedain actually used these stones well past the First Age. These stayed with the culture. This is from The Return of the King. Merry looked up in amazement. He was on a road the like of which he had never seen before, a great work of men's hands in years beyond the reach of song. Upwards it wound, coiling like a snake, boring its way across the sheer slope of rock. Steep as a stair, it looped backwards and forwards as it climbed. Up it horses could walk, and wains could be slowly hauled. But no enemy could come that way, except out of the air, if it was defended from above. At each turn of the road there were great standing stones that had been carved in the likeness of men, huge and clumsy-limbed, squatting cross-legged with their stumpy arms folded on fat bellies. Some, in the wearing of the years, had lost all features save the dark holes of their eyes that still stared sadly at the passers-by. The riders hardly glanced at them, heeded them little. No power or terror was left in them. But Mary gazed at them with wonder and a feeling almost of pity as they loomed up mournfully in the dusk. So Mary is really taken with these stones. Seeing them for the first time, he's filled with, as it says, wonder and pity. And I think it's because there's an ancient legacy represented there. These are relics of a time gone by that probably won't come around again. Meanwhile, the Rohirrim are like, yeah, we've seen these a million times, move on. But note the line, no power or terror was left in them. Now, I always thought that meant the people who placed those statues, the Druedain, were no longer around to defend this cliffside. But let's go back to the story of Beric and Agon, and I think you'll see that it puts a new spin on what that line about no power left in them might mean. Nothing untoward happened for 2 nights, but on the 3rd Beric heard the shrill warning call of the Droogs, or dreamed that he heard it, for it roused no one else. Leaving his bed, he took his bow from the wall and went to a narrow window, and he saw 2 orcs setting fuel against his house and preparing to kindle it. Then Beric was shaken with fear, for marauding orcs carried with them brimstone or some other devilish stuff that was quickly inflamed and not quenched with water. Recovering himself, he bent his bow, but at that moment, just as the flames leapt up, he saw a Droog come running up behind the orcs. One he felled with a blow of his fist, and the other fled. Then he plunged barefoot into the fire, scattering the burning fuel and stamping on the orc flames that ran along the ground. Beric made for the doors, but when he had unbarred them and sprang out, the Droog had disappeared. There was no sign of the smitten orc. The fire was dead, and there remained only a smoke and a stench. Beric went back indoors to comfort his family, who had been roused by the noises and the burning reek. But when it was daylight, he went out again and looked about. He found that the watchstone had gone, but he kept that to himself. Tonight I must be the watchman, he thought. But later in the day, Agon came back and was welcomed with joy. He was wearing high buskins, such as the Droog sometimes wore in hard country among thorns or rocks, and he was weary. But he was smiling and seemed pleased, and he said, I bring good news. My brother is no longer in pain and will not die, for I came in time to withstand the venom. And now I learn that the marauders have been slain or else fled. How have you fared? We are still alive, said Beric, but come with me. I'll show you and tell you more. So Beric and his family are saved by a mysterious Droog, who kills an orc with his bare fists, Helm Hammerhand style, and stamps out the fire with his bare feet. I think you see where this is going. Agan returns the next morning. Yay, he saved his brother. Interesting that the orcs of the First Age were using a form of napalm or Greek fire. Fairly advanced stuff. One would think that they got the recipe from Morgoth or Sauron, perhaps. But let's return to the end of the story. The fascinating reveal and the incredibly evocative final sentence. Then he led Agan to the place of the fire and told him of the attack in the night. The watchstone has gone. Orc work, I guess. What have you to say to that? I will speak when I have looked and thought longer, said Agan. And then he went hither and thither, scanning the ground, and Beric followed him. At length Agan led him to a thicket at the edge of the clearing in which the house stood. There the watchstone was, sitting on a dead orc. But its legs were all blackened and cracked, and one of its feet had split off and lay loose at its side. Agan looked grieved, but he said, Ah, well, he did what he could, and better that his legs should trample orc fire than mine. Then he sat down and unlaced his buskins, and Beric saw that under them there were bandages on his legs. Agan undid them. They are healing already, he said. I had kept vigil by my brother for 2 nights, and last night I slept. I woke before morning came, and I was in pain, and found my legs blistered. Then I guessed what had happened. Alas, if some power passes from you to a thing you have made, then you must take a share in its hurts. Wow, there's a lot there, including that last line like I mentioned. But first, let me read a quick note that Christopher Tolkien added to this story. Note, of this story, my father remarked, the tales, such as the Faithful Stone, that speak of their transferring part of their powers to their artifacts, remind one in miniature of Sauron's transference of power to the foundations of the Barad-dûr and to the ruling ring. So let's start with the powers on display. Agan placed part of his spirit into a life-size stone statue, a golem, or golem if you like, that animated, seemingly woke up Beric telepathically with an alarm, fought the orcs, killing one, and put out the Greek fire before it immolated Beric's house. And at that moment, as the watchstone's legs caught fire, miles away, Agan's legs suffered heat blisters. That's some powerful magic in any fantasy setting. If Agan was a mage in Dungeons & Dragons, he wouldn't be first level, let's just say that. And that brings me back to the line from Return of the King regarding those watchstones. No power or terror was left in them. I think there's a suggestion that at one time, there were Druedain who had infused those watchstones with their spirits, and they could make them attack would-be foes coming up the trail. Now, that would be a daunting defensive maneuver. Statues coming to life, wreaking havoc with their stone fists, nowhere to go but to retreat. The implication is, now that those Druedain are long gone, their spirits no longer animate these stones. And finally, we get Agan's last line. If some power passes from you to a thing that you have made, then you must take a share in its hurts. And just to confirm, yep, that's what he's talking about. Tolkien adds the note that this power is a minor version of Sauron using his spirit to create Barad-dûr and the ring with similar limitations. And that brings home how rare this power is in Tolkien's mythology. Perhaps we see a version of it with the 2 Watchers at the Tower of Cirith Ungol, though we don't really know how they were crafted. But typically, this power, demonstrated by Agan the Droog and seemingly many of the Druedain, is reserved for the most powerful items in Tolkien's legendarium. The ring, the most powerful sword in Arda's history, Gurthang, rumored to contain the spirit of Eol the Dark Elf who originally forged it. And let's not forget the all-powerful Silmarils. There's some room for debate here, but I think Fëanor infused the Silmarils with part of his spirit. We're told the Silmarils were living things and rejoiced in light. And we're told the heart of Fëanor was fast bound to these things that he himself had made. And in the moment when he refuses to give up the Silmarils to relight Aman, he says this: "But Fëanor spoke then and cried bitterly, for the less even as for the greater, there is some deed that he may accomplish but once only, and in that deed his heart shall rest. It may be that I can unlock my jewels, but never again shall I make their like. And if I must break them, I shall break my heart, and I shall be slain." To me, that sounds like his life force, his Fëa, is connected to the Silmarils. And so, Agan, the humble Droog, joins a fairly impressive list, a who's who of beings able to infuse objects with their spirits. Tip of the cap to the Druedain. You do well not to underestimate them. In any case, that's the Faithful Stone. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!